Welcome, everyone. I'm Karen Harper. I'm the president of the Nashville Jung Circle. And this will be our final presentation of 2022. And we'll start again in January on aging. I think, Adele, you might want to say more about that later. We are very pleased to welcome back Tony Caldwell, and especially for this very trending and timely topic on reimagining masculinity. So before our program chair, Adele Tyler, introduces Tony, please remember to keep yourselves muted unless you have a question or a comment. So thank you very much. Adele?
Hey. Hi. Good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Tony Caldwell. Tony is a licensed clinical social worker and Jungian psychotherapist here in Nashville. In 2012, he began his analysis and academic training to become a Jungian analyst, and he is now in the final stages of that certification. And for those of you not familiar with the rigorous requirements to be a Jungian analyst, it is a multi-year process. So congratulations, Tony, on being near the end of that. Tony is a native Mississippian and moved to Nashville several years ago from Oxford, Mississippi, where he was teaching at the University of Mississippi and in practice as a therapist. And in addition, worked on numerous community and national organizations on social justice and interfaith issues. He also has co-authored a textbook on the role of spirituality in healing communities. Tony has presented at various conferences, congregations, and universities across the U.S., including the Hayden Institute. And no stranger to the practical side of today's topic, masculinity, he is the father of 3 sons and grandfather of 1 grandson. He is married to Missy Caldwell, who is also a therapist in private practice. And as if that is not enough activity, Tony is the co-owner of Caldwell Guitars in East Nashville and is an accomplished performing musician. And I personally think it says a lot about his parenting style that he opened this music store in the past year with his son, his 15-year-old son, Silas. Silas had begun this as an online business, buying and selling guitars and equipment. And his dad has gone into business, and they have a bricks and mortar store now in East Nashville. And Tony was gracious enough to accept this assignment or request from the Nashville Jung Circle to work up a talk on masculinity because the board deemed this a very important and timely topic in our culture today. So now I'll turn it over to Tony.
Hello, and thank you for having me, and especially thank you for having me again to the board. It's an honor and a privilege to be here and to be invited back after the first presentation on a not easier topic, the topic of splitting and racism and that sort of thing. This topic is just as difficult. We tend to really run into a lot of shadow and a lot of reactivity and a lot of splitting around the hot button topics with masculinity and in particular what might be labeled as toxic masculinity. So I want to start by sort of giving us an image to work with. I'm a big fan of Hillman's tendency to stick with image. I think that keeps us in a deeper place in these conversations where we can really just get into these sort of surface level political jargon, sort of just splitting. So I want to share my screen real quick and give you an image for us to sit with. This is William Blake's painting called The Christ Child Asleep on the Cross. And I chose this image because as I sat with this topic, I started thinking about the fact that children, all of us as children, we're crucified in some way. And what does it mean to be crucified symbolically? To me, it means, among other things, being wounded by the people who claim to love you, being wounded by your enemies, being wounded by familial energies and powers and activities, by cultural woundings as well. And so this was really inspired by, and I'll share a little later, a conversation I had, or a couple of snippets from a conversation I had with James Hollis about this topic, where he talks about the wounding of the boy being the pathology of the man. And so that's really something that has stuck with me as an individual, as a therapist, as a father. And my grandson's only 6 months old, so it's a little early to get into all of that in his life, because he's still relatively unwounded, as we all were. So seeing once you've experienced a lot of trauma in relation to men, it's pretty nice to see the unfettered child, or the unwounded child, or the person who predates the pathologies that have really caused a lot of harm throughout time. So I wanted to revisit something that's familiar to all of us, which is Erickson's stages, but I want to look at these through the lens of developmental trauma, and also through a Jungian lens as well. Because you start seeing where the true self and the false self start splitting whenever there's traumas at all of these levels, and there always are to some degree. So the first time between a therapist or an analyst and their client or analysand, the first time they experience transference is the first time there's an email or a call placed to inquire about starting the process. Well, of course, for an infant, that starts at birth, if not in utero. So the first set of projections, the first object, the first godlike object, the first object of attachment, the first place that a child will deal with trust versus mistrust is going to be with the primary caregiver, usually the mother. But then we quickly get into, during the age range of stranger anxiety and separation anxiety, this acknowledgement of being a separate self. Shame is introduced. So we tend to think about shame, being something that's particularly activated during middle school and maybe high school. But really, we start learning shame at 2 years old, around the time of potty training. And so another image for that is the image of Adam and Eve leaving the garden. So for each of us, if not at 2, at somewhere around that time, or maybe a little later if we're lucky, there's a sense of exile from the garden, if you will. William Blake puts it so beautifully in his Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. So the opposite of innocence is not badness, but experience. We'll see this a little later in the myth of Hermaphroditus, where there's a wounding. And as much as I've wrestled with it and tried to fight it, every analyst I've processed that with talks about it as a necessary wounding. We're all living in the reality of this world as it is, and this world can be quite wounding. So metaphorically, symbolically, this leaving of the garden is a movement from consciousness to self-consciousness, from awareness to self-awareness, to an acknowledgement that, oh no, I'm separate from the people around me, and sometimes they're not happy with me, or sometimes they're angry, or sometimes they're not dependable. So that universal image for shame, you see between these two images, the covering of the face, the trying not to be here. That's why some teenagers sleep through school. Some stayed up all night. Some are trying not to be there, right? So what happens when, from an early age, and this is before we get into things that happen around puberty and, usually 4th to 7th grade, there's quite a bit of wounding that people carry. You can sometimes tell by the way a person walks in the room how those years went. But almost every time I ask someone to find the particular woundings that they're still carrying as identity, they're usually from that middle school age. So to go back up to this chart, I bet almost everyone here has experienced mistrust, shame, doubt, guilt, inferiority, confusion, isolation, stagnation, and despair. Or at least I have. That's part of the human dilemma. But when we get into identity formation, and this is where I think there's a particular need, and there's even a school system in my hometown that they've isolated sixth graders away from K through 5 and 7 through 12 as a year to try to help with the transition psychosocially and deal with the bullying and the exclusion and the all the bad information that gets absorbed in this time of identity formation that leads to a sense of inferiority and role confusion, which later leads to isolation. It's where a lot of boys learn to stuff their feelings, and then when they are older and in a serious or committed relationship and they're not feeling or expressing feeling, it's because they're being asked to do the thing they were always told not to do. So programming is so important here. And we also have boys who have had experiences of the mother that were maybe consuming, overwhelming. In Freudian terms, some men have been quite castrated, lost their sense of libido or their sense of agency in the world from, chronic pleasing. And sometimes these guys show up in therapy, or their partner or spouse show up in therapy really, really angry that this person, when asked, where do you want to eat? I don't know, wherever you want to go. What do you want to do? I don't care, whatever you want to do. They don't show up. It's a hard time investing. It's a hard time wanting. So a lot of missed opportunity for connection there, so often connected to overwhelming connection as a child. And of course, people that are socialized in either gender can face this, but I think it's, worth pointing out when talking about men that this is especially crippling for men who then show up in ways that tend to lead towards dominance and violence as a way to try to stay safe from a re-experiencing of these early wounds. Definitely not an excuse for that type of behavior, but when looking for the reasons and the places to dig in and sort of unearth the root of this type of behavior, it usually leads to early wounding in relation to a parent. We also have the Peter Pan or the puer. Puella is the term if we're talking about the female sex. But the puer is the Peter Pan, the eternal boy. And, we live in a time where extended adolescence is the norm compared to previous generations. Of staying somewhat childlike, somewhat dependent, maybe on through the 20s or 30s or maybe even beyond, where there's a loss of a sense of drive and commitment and consistency to one's own unfoldment and independence. So in turning back to this image, I have a quote from Thomas Merton, and a lot of the people who speak to me are contemplatives from various traditions. So I'm not implying or trying to impose any sort of literal religious tradition or anything here. But I will speak to Christianity quite often during this because it is the predominant cultural framework that sort of claims a sense of structure or morality within our particular time and place. So that's always a part of any person in the United States upbringing, and part of what's introjected, taken in, downloaded from the environment, whether it's their tradition personally or familial within their family or not. So Thomas Merton says, into this world, this demented inn, in which there's absolutely no room for him at all, Christ comes uninvited. So I think when we go back to this image, if we think of every child as being this unique, precious, loving being, then the world doesn't really have space for that. Any boy, or really any child with an older sibling, can tell you that that's usually a pretty rough go. Sometimes people get a good deal there, but there's usually some at least moderate wounding that comes through that, and then from other children, and then just from the world in general. But I want to speak to a sense of original wholeness, because, in our predominant tradition, there's a focus on an original badness. And I'm not here to talk theology, but I think psychologically that has roots that grow into most everything that we will be talking about today. So, this going back to this leaving of the garden, this becoming conscious, and this sort of chronic homesickness or longing that we all tend to have for some place that we maybe have never been, but I think it was a felt experience. And I'm biased towards the theory that pathology is the opposite of play. And so if play and wonder and curiosity and exploration are our original state, then anxieties, pathologies, neurosis, complexes, all these things are really the opposite of that natural, playful state. Things that happen once the additives and preservatives, and in Blakean terms, experience happens. And so it's all quite reactive. And I think that's important to talk about, because shame and doubt and guilt and inferiority and confusion and despair and stagnation, all these are so toxic that our ways of thinking, processing, therefore the emotions that we feel and the ways that we behave are quite toxic. But I don't know if that toxicity is an original aspect of who we are. I think it's largely about a loss of depth, a loss of connection to the inner world, a loss of containment, and really a loss of being held in a love that's bigger than any fragmentation that we might experience. I spent 15 years, in addition to my practice, working weekly with boys in essentially an orphanage. It was called a group home, but the children never returned to their families. They were all abandoned. And almost every child I ever worked with there over this 15 years, because of early trauma and abandonment, seriously lost, sometimes completely lost the ability to fantasize, daydream, play in a way consistent with active imagination or creative exploration that's not quite literal. Usually when asked what they want to do when they grow up, almost everyone's answer is a pro basketball player. But everything's quite literal in that capacity for imaginative play and access to the inner world. It's quite damaged. And, through major traumas like that, this sort of thing happens, but through, lots of consecutive micro traumas, what Hollis calls accommodations. But every time that we sort of contort ourselves to fit in, with peer groups or with familial or cultural expectations, we get a degree further from access to that inner world. And then it's not surprising that when you see our culture and many others who are under lots of chronic collective stress, we tend to move towards splitting, black and white thinking, because we're already halfway there. We've already learned to split as a coping mechanism when it comes to fitting into affinity groups as kids, and then also the need to fit into affinity groups as adults. So all that does become quite toxic because it's so fragmented and it's so reactive. It's a reaction to a demand from the environment. An image that I use so often with clients around this, when someone's feeling really neurotic because maybe the marriage they're in or the job they're in or some other situation they're in is making them quite neurotic. If there's a mismatch between the inner world and the outer world, my image for that is the polar bear at the Memphis Zoo, because I don't know if he's anxious, but he's obviously quite neurotic in that his inner world and outer world do not match up. They don't align. He's not supposed to be in 95 degrees and 70% humidity. So he's quite uncomfortable, obviously so, agitated. And I think that's a good visual for what developing a neurosis looks like. And so anything that looks like or smells like or just is toxic behaviorally and relationally is going to be informed by those internal splits. The splits between us are going to be informed or actually formed by the splits inside of us. Bullying is a great example where you see a child who's already had his innocence taken, sees that in another child on the playground and wants to take it there as well. So a lot of what we call toxic masculinity is malformed masculinity, and it's a caricature of what most analysts would say is sort of innate masculinity as an energy that exists no matter what our gender is at birth or our sex is at birth, or what we claim as our sex as an adult. So it's a caricature of masculinity precisely because it becomes so unipolar, so one-sided, so imbalanced, reactive, not native. And so I don't hesitate. I know it's dramatic language, but I don't hesitate to call this psychological and spiritual molestation, because it is, if you look at any definition of that word, especially in legal language, it is disturbing the natural state of something. And I don't know any person who's made it through socialization without that experience. Also, boys socialize boys. So when it comes to learning about all of these big topics, sexuality, how to relate to the opposite sex, we have boys teaching boys for the most part about this. We have boys teaching boys about their own bodies. We have mostly men who were boys that learned about their bodies from mothers and then from peers, but not much input from fathers. This is before we get into the fact that, roughly 50% of kids have limited access to fathers. So literal fathering through the literal father is obviously a part of the breakdown as well. But splitting, especially between thinking and feeling and living defensively, where, boys tend to learn to keep feelings hidden, crying is shameful, become quite objectifying most of the time. Sometimes when someone is not in touch with their feeling capacity, and this happens so often, clients talk about this happening in relation to a parent, where you feel objectified, you feel looked at, not seen, or critiqued, not valued. On a recent episode of This Jungian Life with Donald Cowshed, it really struck me when he was talking about how when he asked pretty much anyone, did your parents love you? They say, yeah, my parent was imperfect, but they love me. But when he asked, did your parents really revel in you and enjoy you and really express a sense of joy in spending time with you and that sort of thing, a lot of people move into a more depressive state when asked that question, because that's not always the case. So objectification that happens to children leads to self-objectifying, taking one's inventory, the inner critic, that sort of thing. But it can, at its worst, move into this insecurity-based, means to an end, predatory, opportunistic consumer way of relating to other people, and especially around sexuality, that's really dangerous. There's so much negative projection and so much trying to find completion in the other that's in any sexual union. But when you have these energies present as well, it becomes quite dark. And even when there's a desire for transcendence there, it can lead to a fusion or a dependence or a sense of enslavement to the other or of the other, but this sense of possessiveness. So as a father of three, I've been working with this on multiple levels for a long time. My oldest son's 27. My youngest son's 15. So I've been doing this dad thing with boys for a long time. And, when I was teaching a social psychology class at Ole Miss, and something that really stood out to me because I was watching so many students coming out of poverty or relative poverty and getting degrees and moving into the larger world in these amazing and beautiful ways, but I also saw lots of students who were self-sabotaging and getting stuck. And it was so incredible to teach what that was happening while it was happening and name it. And you didn't even have to say, hey, this applies to you, because we were all recognizing it in ourselves. But this is a good image for the concepts that were being taught in that part of that class. But when an individual child is within their nurturing system, which is mom, dad, extended family, uncles, aunts, cousins, the immediate neighborhood, that's where hopefully we're nurtured in ways that inoculate us from the things that are going to happen as we move into the larger world. Mark Winborn, who spoke here not long ago, really did a lot of us parents a great service in one of his presentations a few years ago, when he reminded us, or maybe made us aware of for the first time, that it's our job as parents to mess up and to fail and wound our kids in the context of love and repair, because that is in some ways an inoculation against further wounding and hurts and letdowns and disappointments in a world where those experiences are going to happen in places that are less contained and less loving. But as children move out into the larger world, to the school, education system, and then out into the bigger systems, political and legal and otherwise, it's called the sustaining system. Coming from a marginalized, almost entirely Black neighborhood outside of my family and one other, I had a first row seat for how things work as we leave our small circles and go into the larger world. And of course, that transition impacted me less than it did a lot of my peers from my neighborhood as we moved into the larger world. But you start seeing where concepts like intersectionality happen, and you start seeing where a lot of pathologies develop. I watched so many peers go down the route of self-preservation through putting on a persona of toughness, and saw so many boys turn into such harmful and maladapted men that did a lot of damage, but it was so obvious that their ways of trying to stay safe were hurting themselves and others. And I'm sure we all, if we thought about it, could think about people we know where that might be the case. But as we move into this larger world, figuring out where we fit, where we don't, and sometimes that's as easy as who will allow me into their group, that sort of thing. You see a lot of, when pathologies start that develop personalities that become school shooters and that sort of thing, it's around this age that those things happen, the middle school, high school age. So you see there's a adaptation is often maladaptation, because what we're having to, in my mind, it starts a grief cycle that's not even known or named, to have to adjust to a situation that is not compatible with who you are. It's like an arranged marriage with a certain societal situation. Which brings us to hermaphroditus. When I was working on my exams for training to be an analyst, I had lots of images come into me. The black sun, the dead moon, which are these opposites, Sol and Luna, showing up in my dreams and in my writing and just in my reverie. And then also the image of the bodhisattva, who is quite androgynous. That's an image of a bodhisattva from the Buddhist tradition, or someone who sort of overcomes suffering to some degree and vows to stay around and help others instead of just becoming purely transcendent. This is an image of the dead moon. This is a fairy tale about masculinity at the end of the day and the need for the feminine. It's an English fairy tale, and it's one that I wrote about in my exams. And in this story, there are two little villages with a swamp between them, and the villagers have to travel through the swamp at night. And there are these entities, these bogies that tend to scare and sort of touch people. And while it's too dark to see what's going on, and the moon provides enough light for some protection to sort of see what's going on when these sort of dark forces are sort of vying for our attention and are quite distracting. Well, one man gets lost and caught in the swamp, and the moon takes pity on him and comes down from the sky to help him get loose. And the moon herself gets stuck and submerged halfway underwater. And so now there's no light at night. And the men are sitting at the tavern one night, and they're talking about the fact that there's no light at night. And one guy says, I know what happened. The moon saved me, and she was stuck herself, and she's still stuck in a lake. And so wouldn't you know it, the way to find balance again was to go consult the witch in the woods. So the wise old woman who instructs the men that they have to hold a stone on their tongue, and they have to be completely silent, and they have to go free the moon. And so they go through this darkness, and all these bogies are grabbing them, and they can't scream or make any sound. They have to be completely silent. And once they serve the feminine, the way the feminine served them, order is restored, the moon is back in the sky, and it's happily ever after. But it's such a great and just so moving, such a moving story of the fact that the masculine and the feminine, whether it's intrapsychic or interpersonal or on a cultural or global basis, need one another and are really inseparable. But that sense of nurturing and giving that is so tied to the feminine through socialization must be found within the masculine, where it serves and honors the feminine as well. So I can't recommend those two enough. The dead moon and Hermaphroditus. So Hermaphroditus is a young boy who is bathing in a lake, and the lake nymph, who is a female, sexually assaults him. And it's a pretty tragic story in that he's left with this lingering sense of resentment and hoping that everyone that enters the pool after him suffers the same consequences as him. But there's such a deep narrative running through this around, and running through the story around necessary wounding and not. I really struggle with this, as I had many an analyst try to help me not be too literal with this, because my social worker brain is like, no, all wounding, sexual wounding is bad, because literally it is. But in this story, it's more about a sense of union between the feminine and the masculine, and more about a sense of learning to navigate the world, and about naivete versus innocence, and experience versus innocence. And a lot of these themes overlap that we've been talking about so far there. And it really puts an emphasis on the fact that, Christianity as a container in our culture is a rupture. in so many ways and for so many reasons. So this introjection, we're mostly familiar with the concept of projection. And I like to think about this as literal projectiles coming out of us or into us. And with that taking in of cultural attitudes or familial expectations as introjection, where the shrapnel lodges in us in the form of ideologies and or at least coping mechanisms, how to stay in the good graces of the people around us. So when introjection happens, the additives and preservatives are in us. We're no longer acting naturally. And I have to tell you, I don't know a man or boy that I can think of that acts naturally. We've all learned how to be unnatural. I'm sure the same is true for those of us born or socialized as women as well. But I do know for men, we learn to self-edit at such a young age that most of the time clients aren't quite sure what that initial authenticity even looks like or can't conceptualize it. So we're usually in the process of feeling our ways back towards what feels like the emotional psychological equivalent of a chiropractic adjustment, like what feels like an original shape. Which brings us to talking about the anima. This quote from Jung in the Red Book: "My soul is a child, and the God in my soul is a child." Honoring the child is such a difficult thing because we tend to, as a species, I think, not honor what's perceived as weakness. So childlikeness is something we're supposed to grow out of. And then, we find ourselves in our 40s and 50s doing inner child work because we've essentially neglected possibly the most important part of who we are. Men, of course, tend to find glimpses of this lost part of themselves in women or in a sexual partner or both. But this tendency to find the disowned or really the gold in the shadow so often in another is so problematic in so many ways because there's this attempt to find completeness or wholeness that always goes belly up at some point. There's a quote from Marion Woodman where she says, if you think of the anima as being nothing but what you know about her, you don't have the receptiveness of a listening attitude. So she becomes nothing but a load of brutal emotions. You've never given her a chance of expressing herself, and therefore she has become inhuman and brutal. And so, among other things, she's talking about the tumultuous inner world of men that comes out as violence and opportunistic ways of navigating relationship. And Marion Woodman also adds to that wholeness comes from the totality of our being when the conscious and the unconscious are in harmony. So whether it's the moon and the sun or hermaphroditus and the bodhisattva, we have this need for integration, the masculine and the feminine as energies that are in harmony with one another. And we see this in Shakti and Shiva in the Hindu tradition. We see it in the yin and the yang symbol. We see it, in immanence and transcendence. We see it in pretty much every culture in some manifestation. And with that, we move into thinking about patriarchy. And I think it's so subversive to think that the predominant tradition religiously that, socializes all of us to some degree, with or without our permission, has this child at the center of the story, and this person who is in the role of sacrifice for holding on to that inner child, for holding on to that child identity, among other things. And then we have what we refer to as patriarchy, which is really a sort of a reverence for the adult male. And Marion Woodman says this: patriarchy is a parody of the masculine. Patriarchy is a control issue. It's vying for power over women and nature, and it shows up in addiction as an attempt to control suffering. For her, the feminine is about process and presence versus productivity, which is one of those cultural attitudes that's really interjected by boys and lived out by men who become really caught up in career and externals, sort of the stereotypical absent man or absent father. Usually it's just going along with the cultural programming, with what's been asked of them, or by doing a really good job of doing what they thought they were supposed to do in this life with their time and energy. For Marion Woodman, the masculine in its purest form is more about discrimination, discernment, action towards a goal, honoring the feminine and working in harmony. And then also the masculine, symbolically and literally, with the so much of the symbolism here be crossing over into the sexual, the phallus and insemination. All this is about creativity, literally and figuratively. James Hillman and Robert Bly really tried to speak to this in the men's movement, this recovery of the inner child, and not a staying stuck on the eternal process of healing, but working in partnership with that child. And if you've not read the book Reconciliation by Thich Nhat Hanh, that is an incredible book about the same topic, just from a different angle. But it's about finding those inner orphans, and literally there's some exercises in there of sitting and holding and working with those inner orphans and making amends with them, apologizing. For instance, I'm paraphrasing, but there's a sentence that essentially says you're holding this part of you that you've abandoned because it was so painful or so embarrassing or shameful. And you say, I'm sorry I didn't have the skill or the confidence or the bravery to take care of you. It's deeply beautiful and intense work. And I do think that's the way out. It's not that easy, but I do think that's a part of a comprehensive plan for a way out of the mess that we find ourselves in so often. And so in the men's movement, the focus was on not selling out or copping out, but actually consciously choosing grief, suffering, uncertainty, and terror, choosing the unknown, going on that inner journey, in Jungian terms, like wrestling with these inner figures, and spending a lot of time in the place Jung was in when he wrote the Red Book. A conscious fragmentation, the disorientation of, to get down to the heart of his question, who were you before you were told who to be? Or the Zen question, who were you before you had a face? But what is this original essence? So living archetypes in a way, not in an inflated way, because when you work with archetypal energy, it's easy to become overwhelmed or inflated. So not in an inflated way, but to step into an archetype and live it in a certain way. And I'll tell you a quick story about Father Richard Rohr. I went to interview him about Jung and Merton a few years ago. And the thing that I walked away from with that meeting was having met someone who was living the father archetype. Before he wrote books and became the sort of guru figure that he is now, he spent 14 years working in a prison as a chaplain. And one of the things he said to me was that he had never met a man in prison who had a positive experience of their father. I'm sure there's some exceptions to that, but that was his estimation of his 14 years there. And he allowed people to call him father and hold that projection until they could withdraw it as part of their repair. And having this male figure who sees them and sees something more primal than their mistakes and their pathologies. And I have to say that was my experience there as well. I think most of us probably don't experience what feels like blessing from an older male figure. But after spending some time with him, when he let me out of the gate there at the Center for Action and Contemplation, he said, you're beautiful and your wife and your son are really lucky. And he closed the door. And that's the last thing he'll ever say to me, because I'll probably never see him again. But that moment has kind of been with me ever since. That was the kind of initiation that boys crave and men crave that we almost never get, and so I feel so sorry for so many partners and spouses for where we guys are trying to get that need met through you. It's quite a burden for sure. So, not to use another hot topic term for no good reason, but it really makes me think about the concept of colonization. Who and what has colonized your soul? Who or what laid claim to the territory in your heart, in your mind, in your psyche, in your felt experience, in your self-concept? Who's still taking up space in those areas inside of you? I think that's a good question to take with you today and maybe ponder is who's still taking up real estate in my sense of self, my self-concept, my identity, my ways of thinking and feeling about self and other and connection. And trying to imagine, because the imaginal realm, it's a big part of what I'm writing about in my thesis, access to that imaginal realm where we can imagine something more, something better, to have hope. And my thesis is on the will to live. There's so much out there about its opposite, which would be like self-euthanasia or suicide or suicidality, something like that. But what I'm curious about is, for the people who make it, for the people who overcome, for the people who heal, what are those ingredients? What's there? What can we learn from those personalities and from those experiences and those stories? So I think that's a good question to start with. Our soul is a child. If the God in our soul, whatever that means to you, is a child, what are the additives and preservatives that created the distance between you then and you now? I have this client who's in his 60s, and we've been working for a while, and we got to this really rich place over the past few months where he remembers being whole at 5 and completely destroyed at 5.5. And for 60 years, he's lived in light of the 5.5-year-old. And now in his last 20 years or so, he wants to live in light of him at 5. And so this going back, this recovery of the more primal self, the even more primal than the wounded self, is amazing. Part of what that's meant for him, the hero's journey. Sometimes it's talked about as this movement outward, but it always means a movement back to the collective also. And bringing what we find there on our journey back to the collective. And for him, that means back to his marriage and back to fathering and all these other places, which brings us to, I wanted to share with you a couple of things. This is what Jung says in the Red Book about these inner barriers that we've been talking about, those internal glass ceilings, or those highly edited places that are there because of wounding. Jung says your barriers are not real limits. They do unnecessary violence to you. Only if you have balance will you make it through this. I'm paraphrasing. Otherwise, you will not notice what is happening. If you nurture your opposite, it'll feel hateful to you, not heroic. You seek the feminine in women, but you should not. You should seek and recognize the feminine in yourself that you've possessed since the beginning. Don't be amused by playing at masculinity. Humankind is both masculine and feminine. You can hardly say what sex your soul is. You will grope in blind desire and be led astray if you don't do this. Remaining with the self, and he uses some pretty funny language here. Remaining with self, not the self, not of the devil. You will remember your humanity. So I think he's talking about moving out from original self into false self there. You will not behave towards woman as man, but as human being. You will recall your femininity. It may seem that you are unmanly, stupid, but accept the ridiculousness of it or suffer distress. Man is enslaved to woman. Know the woman in you, and you will no longer be enslaved to women. Through becoming woman, you were saved from your enslavement to women. It's good to put on women's clothes in order to be free from this tyranny, to move towards completion. The feminine in men is bound up in evil. When you become the mocked, the humiliated, then the white bird of the soul comes flying. The mystery draws near, a gold luster shines. The sun rises from his grave. You have no soul without woman. If you are a human, your soul comes to you. So I love how he completely names integration in such a symbolic and a beautiful poetic way, but in a very literal way as well. That finding completion, and again, to go back to the framework of Christianity, that be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect means wholeness and completion, not perfection or good behavior necessarily. It's about integrity and being in alignment with who we really are. This image is from Khalil Gibran. It's from the Prophet, where he talks about marriage. And some of the work that I do with men is around the codependent, whether it's coming out in haughty or destructive ways, or whether it's this more passive, sort of weak, letting go of personal power way, dealing with codependence within a relationship. And I wanted to share with you what Khalil Gibran says about union or marriage in the Prophet. Then Al-Mitra spoke again and said, "And what of marriage, master?" And he answered, saying, "You were born together, and together you shall be forevermore. You shall be together when the white wings of death scatter your days. You shall be together even in the silent memory of God. But let there be spaces in your togetherness, and let the winds of the heavens dance between you. Love one another, but make not a bond of love. Let it rather be a moving sea between the shores of your souls. Fill each other's cup, but drink not from one cup. Give one another of your bread, but eat not from the same loaf. Sing and dance together and be joyous, but let each one of you be alone, even as the strings of a lute are alone, though they quiver with the same music. Give your hearts, but not into each other's keeping, for only the hand of life can contain your hearts. And stand together, yet not too near together, for the pillars of the temple stand apart, and the oak tree and the cypress grow not in each other's shadow." I love that ends with the word shadow. It's so meaningful on so many different levels, but this sense of codependence that we know about the destructiveness that comes out of the male of the species. There's also such a codependence that is eroding relationship that I see on a daily basis. Such a passivity, and really some of the most angry partners I've ever seen, not necessarily the ones who were betrayed or attacked or something horrible, but it's where the partner is so completely passive that they never really show up. They're just trying to stay out of trouble. It's the spouse who, when their mate gets angry at them, essentially says, just tell me what to say or do to make this go away. And the person with the valid complaint feels even more unseen and unheard, and more like, my partner just wishes I would go away. They really don't want to know me. Which brings me to a couple of things Rumi says about masculinity that I think are really important, because if we're taking an archetypal approach to this topic, then there's so much around these themes that predates psychoanalysis, and that's why I bring in Rumi here. Two short poems by Rumi. One is called The Husk and the Core of Masculinity. Masculinity has a core of clarity which does not act from anger or greed or sensuality, and a husk which does. The viral center that listens within takes pleasure in obeying that truth. Nobility of spirit, the true spontaneous energy of your life, comes as you abandon other motives and move only when you feel the majesty that commands and is the delight of the self. So really a sense of staying out of a neurotic state by staying true to one's own nature. It goes right along with Shakespeare in that way. And then a second short poem from Rumi, The Core of Masculinity. The core of masculinity does not derive from being male, nor friendliness from those who console. Your old grandmother says, maybe you shouldn't go to school, you look a little pale. Run when you hear that. A father's stern slaps are better. Your bodily soul wants comforting. The severe father wants spiritual clarity. He scolds, but eventually leads you into the open. Pray for a tough instructor to hear and act and stay within you. We have been busy accumulating solace. Make us afraid of how we were. So I think there he speaks to the need for that masculine journey, that hero's journey for the male in a particular way that if you took that literally, it sounds pretty awful, but symbolically moving towards wholeness by claiming one's authentic journey over the one that's been laid out for us by others. I want to bring up this image, constellations. So often in training, I hear the word constellation or constellated. We're talking about complexes being constellated, and with complexes being almost like a recipe was put together without our permission. And so the ingredients, the things being constellated, which might be a mother complex and an inferiority complex and several other factors coming together where this autonomous cluster of thoughts and feelings take over, possess the conscious personality, speak and behave according to that, and then sort of return to baseline after that. Chaos has moved on out, like it was a bad storm. So the word possession, I think, is pretty appropriate there, where when someone's in a complex, you're not dealing with who they are when they're not actively being overtaken by a complex. So another takeaway today, hopefully, would be when you are in a complex, and let's just say when you are aware that there are thoughts and feelings beyond your control that you didn't ask for that have shown up and sort of taken reign of your conscious personality, to really dig into meeting those, interviewing those energies and finding out what they're about, because this Jungian way of working is very teleological. So we're looking for, what are these messages trying to bring? At least one thing that's almost always true is that there's something compensatory trying to show up. So if someone's really passive but have anger outbursts, there's an attempt for balance. If someone's really angry most of the time and has a sense of tenderness, you're looking for where are the opportunities for balance? And the complexes are always going to point towards their connectivity to some earlier wounding. hyper defensiveness around criticism. Where does that come from? Is that some experience in the peer group? Is that with parents? Is that with siblings? Is that bad dating situation? What's the core of that? Looking for the historical core and the archetypal core, because a complex always has an archetypal core. It's not just literal. The literal world is going to be where it plays out, but this goes much deeper into the unconscious. On this topic of masculinity, I just want to throw in real quick a few things that other theorists talk about. We know it's pretty much a limited, narrow view of Freud that we usually get in these types of conversations, that would essentially just say he was focused on aggression and sex and drives and impulses and all of that. That what he's most noted for. And to a degree, that's fair, because that was a lot of what he focused on. Winnicott, when it comes to masculinity, so we're thinking about that with Freud, the lizard brain, if you will, or the more primal mammalian part of ourselves. Winnicott talked about the dramatic ejection of the bad. So we want to hold on to the positive view that we have of someone. So, for instance, if a child sees his or her father doing something pretty horrendous, it might be too painful or fragmenting to admit, well, my father is not a good person or has issues or whatever, and they may just adopt that attitude as a way of trying to make it okay. That's just one example. But whether it's internal or it's one of our primary attachment objects, usually a parent, we want to eject the bad. We want to hold on to an image of the good. Adler, his major focus was on the fact that we all have this core experience that goes back to the Erickson's chart earlier of inferiority, that everyone's trying to avoid. This is not his words, these are mine, but trying to avoid that moment where our inner critic and some external critic both see the same thing at the same time, and we feel double teamed and annihilated. That's what half of marital therapy seems to be, is trying to help people get okay with having that experience of self and other agreeing that we have done something problematic, said something problematic, need to make adjustments or amends, and though might require more ego strength than we've had to date in order to be able to do that without feeling annihilated on that level of identity. Two of my favorites, among other theorists, though, Melanie Klein. She talks about object preservation, the need for certainty, and we see that all around us today. What happens when we feel like there's more chaos than certainty, and how the splitting happens around that. Preserving the good object is there with her as well. But I love the fact that she points towards a felt sense of ambivalence towards another human as being a developmental victory. So often we feel like if we're ambivalent towards a friend or spouse or lover or colleague or whatever, that there's a problem. But Melanie Klein actually says that ambivalence is a developmental victory, that the splitting that an infant does is what we do as an adult. So an infant has to get okay, and hurt, in Melanie Klein's language, with the fact that the good breast and the bad breast are attached to the same mother. The wet breast and the dry breast, which symbolically means the mom who picks you up and the mom that lets you cry it out. The mom who fixes things and the mom who says you'll have to figure that out yourself. It's all the same mom. And so the infant can't split into all good or all bad. The infant has to come to the fact that my parent is a complete human that spans the whole entire spectrum of human emotion and human experience. And so much therapy with adults seems to be around the fact that we carry those splits towards our parents on into adulthood, and we see them as all good or all bad, especially when we're under stress or finding ways in which past programming has shown up in repetitive ways as a, and as a reenactment. We're all always reenacting something, or as a repetition compulsion, or some way that old storylines are creeping in and creating similar outcomes in our day-to-day life. And then von Franz, who says that a mature personality can choose its path and remain true to its inner law. Especially in times of collective neurosis, the existence of such a mature personality is of crucial importance. So I think that's part of that's really a big part of what Jungian analysis is maturity of the personality. Coming into what we would call the self, or the capital S, or the true self, requires that the ego be involved at every step of the way. The active ego that we're working with on a daily basis is a lot like, I think of the ego as like a mother. The mother is typically doing most of the work and fielding most of the complaints, or getting most of the criticism. So working hard, dealing with detractors, and keep showing up every day anyway. Right. I think our conscious ego gets a bad rap sometimes, but it's showing up and working every day for us and on our behalf. This is Saint Sebastian, and just because of the story around his attempt to stay true to self, led to being shot with arrows. I think about introjection and projection. And so I really love the projectiles coming from forces around us that are not okay with us tapping into our true self. And I can tell you, raising 3 boys who have held on to that true self, it's not an easy journey to hold on to that through peer relationships and the way that those tend to move towards the lowest common denominator in social settings and that sort of thing. So worth the journey, though. Jung also talked about the fact that judging is easier than thinking. And that's why we mostly judge. And by that, I think he's pointing towards splitting, black and white thinking, falling into good, bad, right or wrong. It's so much easier than trying to hold attention to the opposites and find a third way forward, a more transcendent way. And we see this in all the usual places. Politics are problematic, but that's really, at the end of the day, it's just the stage where human issues are playing out. It's the stage where all of our collective neuroses are colliding. And that's why it's so ugly and so problematic and so divisive and split and all the things. And there's 50 million factors on the literal level. I'm staying on the symbolic level here that gets underneath all of the play-by-play stuff on the surface. But what we see in any given time and place, where the political workings of any place and any time and place are informed by human pathology. I mean, every culture that's ever been made or created was not just built by human ingenuity, but also by human pathology, because it all comes in the same package. So that contrasexual piece, to get back to the theme of being more integrated, the contrasexual, the other sex, if you will, from the sex that of our birth. Jung talks about this in a certain kind of way in Memory Streams Reflections when he talks about the 2 personalities of his mom. sub-personalities, splinter personalities, these archetypes of the collective showing up in ways that look like there are multiple people being involved, even though it's in the packaging of his mom. And I think the deadness of his mom in some ways, the deadness of his father. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that he's the one that pointed out that the unlived life of the parent is potentially the greatest burden on a child. The deadness of their marriage leads me to think about, couples that I've worked with in therapy, whether they're in this, none of this, I hope it goes without saying, but I'll throw it out there one more time just to be sure that we're tracking. None of this at the end of the day has so much to do with literal who you are based on genitalia, right? All that is so important too. And I think we're speaking to that, but the energies here. So whether the couple's 2 women, 2 men, or someone of each sex, I'm always blown away by how perfectly awful people come together based around the incompatibility of their pathologies. It's almost like psyche is setting us up to reenact and re-experience, or to reenact and heal old pathologies. We're so obviously drawn to positive and negative qualities of the parent that we see in another person. And romance brings enough sparkle to cover that up long enough to get deeper into it than we would if we were fully conscious. Because we're never closer to insane, most of us, than when we're in love, because positive projections abound and we're literally out of our minds in a really euphoric way. But I see where what was not allowed in us in childhood is seen in our partner, and then we'll fight it there, or try to take it there, claim it there, or merge in order to have access to it. But so often what happens, and particularly in the male species, is that not just a merger with that quality, or an appreciation with that quality, or a unity with that quality, but that turning that happens almost like when your pet ends up biting you. This unconscious mission to heal self also can veer towards wanting to conquer, kill, take, not just heal and repair. There's a real animalistic quality that can come out when someone's activated or in a complex. And so many times I think especially men are attracted to what's missing in them, but then when they find it, they want to kill it there. So they might experience their feeling function in a female partner, but then at some point they're going to accuse her of being too emotional and too dramatic, right? That sort of thing. Same thing that happened to them, maybe by a parent or a peer when they cried, when they hurt themselves playing or something, but another enactment. But our wounds and our deficits set us up for our selection process when we choose a mate. That it can be with consciousness, it can be teleological. It can be, we can move towards repair and healing and overcoming these old patterns, but without consciousness, we're just going to be in a repetitive, compulsive way of reenacting things and fighting indefinitely within our relationships. But really, that's the only way we truly get to choose someone in a long-term relationship, is to move into that symbiotic, half crazy, beautiful, positive, projective state of being, to fall out of love with that image, because another person can't hold that screen forever. And that's the first time we actually have the opportunity to actually choose the other person, or even see them enough to actually choose them. And then there's the fact that we've so been taught in our culture compensatory ways of interacting. For instance, one of the best ways to avoid being intimate is to be sexual. one of the best ways to avoid communication is talking. They look the same, they seem the same, but they're very different. They're qualitatively very different. And moving into those opposites, moving out of the places where adaptation and conformity and editing ourselves, compromising, contorting, operating in ways that seek validation and mirroring and safety. When we stop doing that and are willing to die that death and suffer that wound, we move into what Hollis talks about as true maturity and adulthood. Part of the place this falls apart is when teens take their sense of identity from the family and hand it to a peer group on the way to having some more, hopefully more solid sense of self as an adult. But I've never seen that go well. Peers just can't tell a kid who they are. They don't know. So that's a part in our evolution that just tends not to go very well for most people. But again, it's one of those necessary woundings. Jung says an individual may strive for perfection, but must suffer the opposite of their intent for the sake of completeness. So there's so many woundings that are just necessary. And I love the fact that Jung talks about the fact that regressions are actually necessary and that they're possible. So hopefully that's another thing you can take today, is when you regress, whether that's behavior or a crutch or whatever it might be, a regression actually is necessary to go back and address something earlier that's been skipped over. So it's a movement, a step back so that you can take 2 steps forward is actually a movement towards completion or wholeness or a more comprehensive healing. So maybe think about where your regressive places are and try to bring some imagination to how that might be serving balance, how that pull back may almost be like a slingshot and not just some step backwards into something that feels like the 50th time you've fallen into some sort of complex. Erickson back in 1950 talked about the American identity, and it's he wrote about it. Actually have the book here, Childhood and Society, but it's not all that different. I know that's been a while back, but it's not all that different. But he's talking about the among other things, the way that we get pulled out of ourselves in a consumer culture or a capitalist culture, and there's so many positives to those types of cultures, but there's always a consequence to everything. And so in our context, this being pulled out of ourselves and getting identity from the externals has led to, if you look at statistics now, usually you'll see that per capita, the most depressed and the most pharmaceutically addicted and the most suicidal cohort is often retired white men. And it's because we're taught for a lifetime to get external validation, to get our identity from achievement and attainment. And then we retire or slow down, and the inner world has been neglected for a lifetime because we did a really good job of doing what we were told to do. And loneliness isn't possible because solitude isn't possible because we experience loneliness instead when we're still in quiet without all those distractions and the rhythms of work and, after empty nest and that sort of thing. So I think that any discussion for me around the toxic aspects of masculinity have to address the initial wounding of the psyche of the boy that, fragmented and fermented into problematic behaviors that are informed by so much suffering that they cause so much damage in the world. And I know it's not just that simple. This is only one aspect of this conversation could go forever in a million different directions. But I do think addressing that early wounding and trying to prevent it to the extent possible is so much more important than the lifelong process of working on things after they're already broken, internally. So prevention is so important. I want to move over to, if it's possible, this conversation I had with James Hollis. There's two little sections in this interview. I'm going to look for my time markers real quick. It's a long interview, but there's only two little sections I think are really helpful. But when I asked him about this topic, he had some really interesting answers. And I want to share those with you as long as the audio works. If not, I'll send this to you through the link. All right. So I'm going to move to time marker 26:05. Could you hear that when it came on? Anybody?
Yes, momentarily, yeah.
Okay. All right. So here's about a 7-minute clip of talking with James Hollis, and I asked him about the socialization of men.
And again, inviting our conversation with it.
As you say all of that, I'm thinking about the poor socialization of males in our culture, the extended adolescence that we see so frequently, and also in older males, how older white males in particular have some of the highest suicide rates in the nation, and addiction rates as well. And I'm wondering, and also violence, and all in the context of what is, I guess, on paper supposed to be either a patriarchal or a patriarchal society, or a patriarchal society in recovery from all the damages done in that area. And I'm wondering if you could link some of that for us as far as male socialization, and maybe even how the masculine feminine balance in men is damaged from, within the first few years of life.
Sure. Well, it's a huge subject. And, again, promoting books, I'm just saying these are subjects that I've been addressing for some time, and I'm very interested in them. I wrote a book 20-some years ago called Under Saturn's Shadow, The Wounding and Healing of Men. And men are an endangered species. Women have historically been oppressed and abused, and have rightly challenged those systems and challenged the one-sidedness of our culture, and they're increasingly free for that. They're finding their own pathways, and more power to them. Most men today are pretty much lost and adrift. There was a time when men had pretty clear marching orders, and now the marching orders are not working so well. And there was always a fearful price. One should never engage in nostalgia about a better time in the past. It was a lousy time in the past, a time of one-sidedness, a time of oppression for men and for women. And men are at least as damaged as women, and often, I think, in worse shape than women. So I've said this to women's groups who've asked me to talk about those strange creatures who are men. And I said, well, try to imagine three things. First of all, try to imagine that you have to sort of cut away all of your close friends, the ones that you talk about your marriage with, your children, your fears, your body, your hopes, the people you can let be yourself with and laugh and feel silly. But those people are gone forever in your life, and you're essentially unable to address that kind of thing at all. Secondly, sever that internal link you have as a woman to whatever your guiding source is. Call it your instinct or your intuition or what, but that's severed forever. And thirdly, learn that your worth as a person is based essentially on meeting abstract standards of productivity in the external world out there, standards created essentially by anonymous strangers. And I said, if you can imagine those three things, you will experience something of the life of the ordinary man. And most of them are appalled because they immediately realize that, well, that would be horrible. First of all, you have that horrible isolation. You're terribly, terribly alone. And secondly, you're adrift. You're at the mercy of the forces around you. You know, if you don't have that link to your own guiding source. And thirdly, you're always sort of like, greyhound chasing the rabbit around the track. And you're supposed to be pursuing something called success. Well, people get to what they want, they realize there's no there. And so men are enlisted in a deadly game, a zero-sum game, winners and losers. And men from childhood on, I've experienced this, and I'm sure you have as well, are quickly shamed if they show any signs of really a sort of personal suffering or alleged weakness or even wanting to be kind and sharing. And there's a risk for doing that. There's a risk for emotional honesty and a risk for emotional awareness. And so over time, men even get separated from being aware of those forces within them. I mean, the conditioning and the constant sort of stimulus response of dealing with our culture and its expectations leads to a profound loneliness and self-estrangement. And over time, that in turn leads to estrangement from other people. I mean, in other words, how could I have a relationship with my partner when I have a disturbed or absent relationship with myself? And so men's inner life, which Jung, 100 years ago, literally 100 years ago, talked about as the inner world, the anima, the feminine side of a man's nature is that guiding compass. It's the source of our instinctual wisdom, of our feeling life, of our spiritual life. And yet, if I'm separated from it, I'm adrift. Now, today we wouldn't have to label it my inner feminine. We just say it's part of my masculinity that has been severed or repressed. Just as women have, many times through patriarchal systems and roles and so forth, have had their own inner life oppressed and repressed. And so, the damage through the years of social roles. I mean, there's a place for a social role that has to do with addressing the tasks of daily life. But we're talking about where the role, in a sense, is imposed upon a person and dictates his or her choices, values, behaviors, expectations, and goals. And when you look at that, then you realize, well, women have, for the last few decades, have rightly challenged, and they have miles to go, but men are barely started.
So I hear people often using words like splitting when...
So I'll stop there. There's another section I want you to hear from him that's only like 3 minutes long, but you just have to love James Hollis, right? He's pretty amazing guy. So when I ask him about this socialization of boys, just from a parental perspective, real quick, I just want you to hear his response here real quick.
As the soul would see it, not as the world sees it. And sometimes the best thing you can do is walk away from that job, walk away from that old behavior, because it may or may not have served, but it's certainly not working for you now.
Is there any way to prepare children and adolescents for midlife, or is that even a good idea? Is it best just to wait until that summon comes for each individual?
That's a good question, and I've been asked it many times because as parents, we want to spare our children these travails. I can assure you that. And by the way, for most of our ancestors, not all of them, of course, for most of our ancestors, these kinds of changes that occur intrapsychically happened not as often for the simple reason they didn't live as long. In other words, in North America, the average length of life in 1900 was 47. Think of that. And in 1934 or 5, when the Social Security was created in America, people were dying at 67. And it was only supposed to last 2 years. That's why it's running out of money. And today it's around 80. Now that's That's an extra 2 or 3 lives compared to most of our ancestors statistically. So, and I should say the weight, gravity, and power of socialized roles was so much greater for our ancestors. I grew up in that world. And the sentence I most heard was, "What will people think?" And it was the touchstone of my parents' lives and choices. And if people wouldn't, necessarily approve or applaud what they've done or understand what they've done, they didn't do it. So they lived, sadly, lives of diminished possibility. And I grieve that. I don't judge it. I grieve it. And I recognize along the way I had to, break from that tyranny. It's still there. It's not gone in one's psyche or one's culture, but it's something that we have to challenge. So then the question is, can children understand this? You could get a child or an adolescent to read a book, but it doesn't compute until they have the experiential hooks to place them on. Now, one of the reasons I left academia was, with all the respect to 18 and 19-year-olds, I could talk to them about ideas and information and so forth, but we really couldn't have this kind of conversation with a deep feeling and with a reservoir of life experience to draw upon. And it wasn't their fault. They were just at the beginning of the journey. And I remember thinking, well, I'd like to have a conversation with you when you're 40. So I left academia and started conversations with 40-year-olds, metaphorically. In fact, Jung actually says at one of the points in his work, he said, we educate our young, but we have no colleges for 40-year-olds to prepare ourselves for the second half of life. And the second half of life has a different agenda. Hopefully you've achieved enough ego strength and enough investment in the world in terms of learning to take care of yourself and support yourself and create relationships and social engagements. That's a task that's necessary in that ego development formation in the first half of life. But the second half of life, you have to say, all right, I'm not just a set of respondings or a set of attitudes and reflexive impositions of the past. Why am I here really? And in service to what? That's where these other questions come up. And they're psycho-spiritual questions. They involve us psychologically, but they're also spiritual in the sense they summon us to be accountable for our highest values.
I want to be.
All right. So I'm going to take the share screen off now. I love his input, and it gives me a landing place here to, I want to go back to that because he essentially just described, among other things, that colonizing pressure that comes to all of us from any culture and any time and any place on the level of soul, body, spirit, land, resources, the agendas of the shoulds, oughts, have-tos, a life of pleasing, and that sort of mammalian terror of not belonging to the pack or the tribe or the pride or the group can really keep us in a state that's not true to who we really are. And that's part of what individuation is about, is recovering that truer self. So, in a world where things happen like native peoples being wiped out and replaced with sports teams, or enslaved people made to suffer to the point of creating a strain of music that's now seen as entertainment, among other things, also crushes boys and builds monuments to disordered men that create a lot of suffering. The conquerors and conquistadors and the rappers and politicians and people in positions of power and stars and people famous simply for being famous has us asking what is so civilized about civilization. Henry David Thoreau and St. Francis of Assisi were two of the main characters that were looked at in the men's movement by James Hillman and Robert Bly as keeping some sense of wildness, and not wildness in a destructive way, but wildness as in an original wholeness. Thomas More, kind of alludes to that in his book, Original Wholeness, or Original Self, maybe it is. and even, you know, on the literal level, we live in a time where people talk about pronouns and gender identity and things like that. And it's sort of heartbreaking to see that mostly talked about in a way that's so surface level and seen as problematic and all these things, when I think any good Jungian is going to think, what is seeking balance here? You know, what is seeking balance and correction? How is the ship being steered in a different way just to get back to some place that looks like an original destination? You know, like, what are all the different ways that the overemphasis on not just the masculine, but the disordered masculine, the disordered adult masculine that's rooted in the wounded boy needs some correction. And there's so many ways that, you know, if symptoms, not just personally, but collectively, are leading towards some sort of new life, if they're acting as a counterweight to something that's out of balance. And we have to keep in fact that in a Jungian view, the poles, anywhere that there's polarization, the poles are actually where energy is generated. So you can't just blast one or both poles and expect everything to be okay. Those are there for the creation of energy that hopefully can be made into a transcendent third if we can hold on long enough and strong enough. So I think the challenge out of all these people that we've heard from today in this presentation is to tend the inner world, and that is to be countercultural, to suffer the weight of consciousness. The journey is always a return to the collective and bringing what we find on our journeys back to the collective. You know, in my experience, and I'm so not one for bypassing, I spent 27 years doing racial conciliation work and other work down in Mississippi, and not one to avoid or spiritual bypass or anything, but there is something about, and I've learned the hard way from making many a mistake, there's something about making sure that you can still see the child in the person that you disagree with that might just help in ways that all the fighting and fussing in the world just probably won't. And you know, from my social work background, I can tell you I learned a lot working through the years with. I had to write it down because I couldn't remember it all. I've worked with men and boys in inpatient treatment, residential treatment, jails, prisons, schools, alternative schools, court-ordered programs, child welfare, medical social work, private practice. And I learned more about how men deal with suffering and act it out in destructive ways in one place. That I learned more in one place than I learned in all of those places. And that was when I was 21 years old. For a couple of years, I was a home health nurse's aide. And I learned more about being a therapist in those situations. Very intimate, very painful, end of life, lots of suffering, a lot of people in the stagnant despair from a life not well lived, or a life that was taken from them as a child and they just sort of rode the rest out, you know, and a lot of beautiful things too. But at the end of the day, I don't think there's any movement towards wholeness or restoration or true containment, true relationship, anything along those lines without some level of acceptance and holding and finding a love that's bigger than the pathology within ourselves, whether it's with the client or a loved one, or most especially with ourselves, because however we relate to ourselves is going to be what we do to the world. And that's where I want to land, is that there are so many problematic things about the socialization of men and boys and the behavior that comes out of that and the ways of relating that are horrendous. But it has been my experience that among many other things, boys tend to grow up and do to the world what the world did to them when they were boys. And so I really do think the protection of the hearts, minds, souls, psyches of all our children is so incredibly important. And there's usually more of an emphasis on the socialization of girls around some of these things. Girls are taught to get out of themselves way younger, and sometimes in ways that aren't very helpful, but boys tend to not get that at all, or even any way. Most men don't report to me that as boys, or maybe even as men, that they know a person or many people who actually sees their soul and speaks to it. And I do think that's a major part of a comprehensive way out that we, as whether it's Ram Dass or Carl Jung or probably a lot of other people, we have to do our own work. If we're going to work our dharma or our truth, we're going to have to live our karma or our circumstance, our lot, what we're given to work with. And at the end of the day, I think becoming more conscious as best we can is the best path forward that I know of to this point. So I think I'll leave it there. And if we have any discussion or questions or anything, I'll answer to the best of my ability. Thank you.